It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Conservative MP and former Cabinet Minister Stephen Crabb, Labour MP Kim Leadbeater, The New Statesman's political editor Stephen Bush and talk radio presenter Julia Hartley-Brewer. Today, the police will investigate Number 10 parties.
I can confirm that the Met is now investigating a number of events that took place at Downing Street and Whitehall in the last 2 years in relation to potential breaches of COVID-19 regulations.
Cabinet ministers come to Boris Johnson's defence over the latest party allegations.
The leadership of Boris Johnson this country has been so brilliant that he has got us through this incredibly difficult period and he's got all the big decisions right.
But Conservative and Labour critics aren't impressed after reports of an event on the Prime Minister's birthday in 2020.
It's difficult to see how a birthday party cannot be a party, particularly when there are people who don't work in Number 10 who've been invited to it.
Was he at a party? Did he know about a party? He didn't realise the rules. He is the Prime Minister of our country, and he has breached that trust.
It's dangerous to assume that Omicron will be the last variant or that we are in the end game.
So is it right to drop COVID restrictions here?
Invading Ukraine from a Russian perspective is going to be a painful, violent and bloody business.
The risk of conflict remains real and we continue to call on Russia to de-escalate and choose the path of diplomacy.
Strong words for President Putin over Ukraine, but does Europe's reliance on Russian gas make us weaker? So you heard Dame Cressida Dick there in the headlines announcing that the Metropolitan Police have launched an investigation into some of the Downing Street parties. She was being questioned at the London Assembly. In response, she said that given the limited resources that they have come to a decision that it is right for the police to look at these allegations of parties. Do you agree? Is it right for them to investigate?
Yeah, I support that decision. And in fact, I made that point to some of my constituents about 10 days ago when I was replying to the many emails I had about that issue. For me, what's really important, and for a lot of my colleagues, is how do we draw a line under this episode? And there's only really two routes. One is the internal investigation process with Sue Gray, and I, for one, have a lot of confidence in the work that Sue is doing on that. But the other one is the police. You know, when there are allegations of people breaking rules and laws, you would expect the police to investigate. And even if they come to a decision that there isn't the evidence or it's not in the public interest to take it further, they have done their job. And that, to me, that's the only way that we can really have a hope of drawing a line under this and hopefully moving on. Because I can tell you, from what I'm picking up from constituents, the ones who were really angry 10 days ago, some of them are now at a point saying, can we just move on, please? Yes, all of this stuff is really important. It's important for trust in politics and the credibility of the government. But there are some really, really big and serious issues other than Partygate.
Are those same constituents also asking for you to call for Boris Johnson to resign?
Some of them have.
Right, full stop. Kim, Labour has been calling for a police investigation, or certainly asking why the police haven't been investigating. Now they are. It looks as if the report by Sue Gray, the civil servant looking at all the allegations of parties, the publication of that will be delayed. So is it right that the Met Police are investigating?
I think it's right that there's a police investigation. I think it's right that Sue Gray does her investigation. But like many people who've contacted me, I am absolutely sick of hearing about this, whether it's cheese, wine, birthday cake or pork pies. I think people are just sick of the hypocrisy and the arrogance that has clearly been taking place during the pandemic, during lockdown, by the Prime Minister, by the government. And you know, it's a distraction from the serious issues that are going on in the world, as Stephen has alluded to. You know, we've got the Ukraine crisis, we've got, you know, still getting through the pandemic, we've got a cost of living crisis. It's a massive distraction, but it's also really important because it gets to the heart of our politics. And I worry that this disengages people from politics, even more than they're already disengaged. I worry that it shatters people's trust in politics, which is already at a very low ebb. And it worries me that, you know, the good people who put themselves forward for public life, you know, are tarred with the same brush. And that's really upsetting. And ultimately, you know, I stand with the people in 2020 who lost loved ones, who couldn't go to funerals, who couldn't have their own birthday parties. You know, those people are angry and they're really, really upset.
Julia?
I think it says something that the way to rescue the Prime Minister this week is to have a police investigation into possible criminal wrongdoing. It really says something about the difficulties he's facing. Yeah, I know, you know, I'm talking about this a lot on my radio show. People are fed up to the back teeth about this. But, you know, we can stop talking about it when the matter is closed. We need to see the Seagrave report. We need that police investigation. I think it's absurd that the Seagrave report should be delayed by that, given a lot of the police investigation only comes about as a result of her investigation. But the key thing here is that there's a really easy way for us not to have been talking about this, and this would be for the people in charge of running the country not to be breaking the rules that they imposed on everyone else. And the reason why they did break those rules is they knew those rules were not actually life and death issues. They weren't going to blow out the candles on a birthday cake in the cabinet room on the 19th of June 2020 thinking, oh, we're taking our life in our hands, we might die if we do that. But they told everyone else that we were. It's the dishonesty, it's the arrogance, it's the total attitude of we can do what we want and you have to obey the rules. That is what people are angry about, not about someone having a birthday party.
Well, where are you, Stephen? Is it right in your mind that this is something for the Metropolitan Police to investigate?
I mean, yes, partly because if you think about, you know, the lives of anyone who, you know, lives in a block of flats or, you know, doesn't have a garden, so was perhaps lingering slightly longer than they should have been in a public park. Ordinary citizens have been, you know, policed sort of to the nth degree during the last 2 years. I think it's definitely appropriate for the police to treat Downing Street in the same way they have treated, you know, thousands upon thousands of, you know, ordinary citizens throughout the pandemic.
Right. Well, I've heard most of you on the panel saying we want to stop talking about it, but we are going to talk about it for a little bit longer because we're going to look at the latest party allegation that emerged last night. ITV News reported that up to 30 people attended a gathering for the Prime Minister on the 19th of June. Staff sang happy birthday and they were served cake. Number 10 said staff had gathered briefly to wish the Prime Minister a happy birthday, adding that he had been there for less than 10 minutes. Let's just show you some reaction from the party itself. Ruth Davidson, Conservative peer, she tweeted this. By coincidence, my partner shares a birthday with the Prime Minister. We marked it in 2020 by inviting one other household to sit outside, socially distanced in our garden, the rules at the time. It didn't occur to us, literally couldn't conceive that we would act outside the rules. The Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries, tweeted this in response. Ruth, you were at home with your partner. The PM was working in Downing Street with hundreds of staff in COVID war room offices. What is the comparison? Stephen? Are you with Nadine or are you with Ruth Davidson?
I'm with myself on this, in that this is a concerning report and it adds to another layer to the multiple reports that have featured in the press. And different people, myself included, different members of the public...
Number 10 have said it happened.
People will find different reasons to feel outraged at different episodes that have been reported. For some, it will be the fact that a party was held allegedly on the eve of the funeral of the Duke of Edinburgh. Sure. People will feel very angry about that. For others, it's that resonance of not being able to have a birthday for your child. So different people will feel different things about these.
And how did you feel about this? Are you closer to what Ruth Davidson expressed or Nadine Dorries?
Look, I'll be absolutely honest with you. I don't feel as outraged about the report that appeared last night as I did about the allegation of effectively Downing Street being turned into a nightclub on the eve of the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral. That, for me, really, really made me cross. But as I said, different people will have different sensibilities around this.
Has it changed your support or view of the Prime Minister?
The instinct of the vast majority of my colleagues, and I'm including myself in that, is to back their team captain, to back the leader. That is still where the majority of Conservative MPs are at. They want to be able to get out there, give full-throated support to their Prime Minister, but they also know we need to get through this episode, and somehow the Prime Minister needs to come through this and get back on the front foot and restore his own credibility as Prime Minister.
Right, we're talking about a culture that existed at Downing Street. Are you close to putting in a letter of no confidence in Boris Johnson as a result of this and the anger that you felt at the previous allegation on the eve of the funeral of the Duke of Edinburgh? Are you any closer to putting in that letter to trigger a leadership contest?
No, and I'll tell you why. I think right now is a terrible, terrible time to think about a leadership election. When you've got 127,000 Russian troops on the border with Ukraine, a leadership election involves at least 1 or 2 months of sclerosis and gumming up of government. So I don't think it would be in the national interest to try and topple the Prime Minister at such a sensitive moment for our country.
Was May 1940 a bad time to replace the Prime Minister?
Yeah, so there are historic analogies people refer to at different times completely.
Right.
But as I say, the bulk of my party colleagues, the sensible people that I mix with, we're in a similar place on this. We want to see the Prime Minister get through this, but these are serious matters, and we wait to see the outcome of the processes in place.
You're nodding there. Kim, do you think this is not a good time to have a leadership contest?
No, I'm just not sure how true that is. The majority of colleagues are on the same page. I think, look, we need somebody who is capable of running the country and dealing with all the issues that the country's got to deal with at this moment in time. And that is not Boris Johnson, as far as I'm concerned. He has lost the faith of the public. He's lost the trust of the public, the hypocrisy, the arrogance. It's just all gone too far. We've all got our stories of what we were doing in June 2020. You know, it was 3 days before the Prime Minister's birthday was the anniversary of my sister's murder. And I would have loved to have gone round and seen my mum and dad and given them a big hug. But you know what? I didn't do it because it was the wrong thing to do. Because I wanted to obey by the rules. I wanted to put public health at the front of what I was doing. And just that sense of injustice that people feel is not going to go away. And he needs to go.
Right, and it's stories like that, real experiences that Kim felt at precisely that time that so many other people that you will have spoken to, if not yourself, were doing or not doing.
Every single person has a story, every single family has a story, and they're going to continue to do so because it rings true. Everyone can remember exactly what they were doing because basically we weren't allowed to do very much on those days. And this is the thing, there are lots of issues that need to be taken care of. Yeah, absolutely, Ukraine, and something I've talked about a lot, and needing us to take action. We've got, a health crisis. I mean, unbelievable. This is going to knock, in terms of the deaths, this is going to knock COVID into the long grass in terms of the NHS backlog. We've got a crisis in education. We have the cost of living crisis, got the energy crisis, the net zero, which needs to be overturned. So much. But so many of those problems come about from the lockdown policies, which the Prime Minister enforced on the rest of us and then didn't obey himself. This goes back to like the expenses scandal in 2008. It wasn't about the cost of a bath plug or a moat house, a duck house or whatever it was. It wasn't. It's about integrity. And it's about honesty. It's about the need that if our Prime Minister did send our troops to war to defend Ukraine or another state in Eastern Europe, would we trust what he said at the dispatch box? Now we know for a fact that certainly one of the statements he's made in the House of Commons is categorically untrue.
Stephen?
Well, I don't know that
he said he was surprised to learn there'd been any parties because he hadn't been at anything. We know he was at parties and he wasn't surprised you already knew.
With respect, I think you're prejudging.
No, on his own words, compared with what number 10 statements have said, he has already lied to Parliament.
Part of the problem here is that we've effectively had trial by the press and social media with drip reports of these episodes. And in any investigation, nuance, context, mitigating circumstances...
We weren't allowed nuance. We weren't allowed nuance in our lives.
And also, Julia has a point in the sense that the Prime Minister said, I don't know of any parties. I've been assured that no rules were broken. If parties did happen, I wasn't at parties. And now we know that he is. I mean, doesn't that change it for you, Stephen?
The Prime Minister has been very strong in saying that he didn't mislead Parliament. And any deliberate misleading of Parliament by a minister or the Prime Minister is an extremely serious matter with leading to potential resignation. So one of the things that myself and colleagues are looking for from the Sue Gray report is hopefully an indication of, is that true? Has the Prime Minister been completely truthful? And we hope that he comes through this.
Stephen Bush, listening to what Stephen Crabb has just said about where the majority of his Conservative colleagues are, do you agree with that? Or do you think things are shifting in the minds of people as we now have to wait longer to get the publication, probably, of both the report and the police investigation?
Well, I think, the other Stephen is right to say that the majority of Conservative MPs do think this is not a good time to have a change of leader, not least because, the new leader would immediately face, potential conflict over Ukraine, rising cost of living, the very difficult sort of question of how they disentangle themselves from the energy price cap. However, the question MPs then ask themselves is how much damage is going to be done to the party and to the government's moral authority if this continues for a long time? And, you know, Julia is exactly right to say the underlying problem here is that these are all laws and regulations that everyone else has to follow. You know, if you're a HGV driver, you couldn't have a birthday party in the break room. If you're a teacher, you couldn't have a birthday party in the staff room. And it's very difficult, and this is the question lots of MPs are asking themselves, look, does this do so much damage to our standing that we're better off pulling the bandage off now? And I think on any given day, you can see how momentum shifts from one way to the other. You know, last week he was saved by Christian Wakeford to defection. This week he may be saved by Vladimir Putin. But I don't think someone's going to defect or invade the Ukraine every single week for the rest of the year. So sooner or later, the Prime Minister's going to have a problem.
Well, I think we can agree with you on the former part of that sentence. Let's talk to my colleague, BBC political correspondent Chris Mason. Chris is there in Central Lobby. Chris, everything has been hanging to some extent on this report by Sue Gray, the civil servant tasked with investigating what happened at Downing Street and all the various allegations. It looks as if that is now going to be delayed, the publication of it. I think she's carrying on with the investigation, but the publication of it because of this announcement by the Metropolitan Police. How are Tory MPs reacting to that?
Yeah, hello, Jo. News blooming heck, to borrow from Sir Alex Ferguson and give it a little broadcastable twist. How are Conservative MPs responding to it? Running for the hills, to be quite honest. I had a minister last night who I was approaching who actually jogged away from me, such as my magnetic appeal.
Surely you could catch up, Chris.
Honestly, literally bounded away, such was their Olympian desire to avoid conversation with me, which is perfectly fair, and you may conclude a perfectly rational judgment, but offers you some insight into, you know, how difficult this is for the most important electorate in the country at the moment, which is Conservative MPs who hold the Prime Minister's fate and other things in their hands right now as they decide what to do. And to address your question directly, Jo, I think what's fascinating is that clearly there's a lot of news at the moment. Every MP I do speak to who is willing to chat away immediately asks, have I missed anything, because they've not looked at their phone in the previous 15 seconds.
I know how they feel.
And so there's definitely that kind of sense. But I think if we take a step back, what I think is intriguing this lunchtime, and frankly no one knows the answer to this, is does the intervention of the Metropolitan Police in terms of how this plays out politically, does it take some of the energy out of the atmosphere here over the coming days? Because collectively Westminster was counting down to the publication of Sue Gray's report. It was imminent, to use one of those most elastic terms in the Westminster vernacular. In other words, we were expecting it this week. MPs continued to hold up a shield, Conservative MPs, that said Sue Gray on it whenever you asked a question about what was going on. And now that's kicked a little bit further down the track. And does that mean that some of the energy sort of dissipates out of this, or does it create an atmosphere where nothing else can get any attention whatsoever, and therefore Conservative MPs feel compelled to act now? I think that's the big question this lunchtime, and to be honest, I'm not sure there's an answer to one other than a guess.
No, absolutely, I hear you. Stay with us if you can, Chris, for a moment. Kim, do you think it's right that the Sue Gray report, the investigation into parties at Downing Street, is delayed by the Metropolitan Police inquiry?
I mean, the timing of it, does it matter, doesn't it matter? For me, this is about the broader picture, which Julia's alluded to, which is about the state of government at the moment. It's about the state of government, it's about the honesty and the integrity of the Prime Minister. So whether this takes days or weeks, I mean, none of it's helpful. I don't think it's helpful for politics generally. I don't think it's helpful that we've got the country paralysed by this. I don't think that's helpful. So I would hope it would happen sooner rather than later. But it's the bigger picture that worries me about this. It's this lack of integrity at the heart of government, and that's what I hope people are seeing. Even though they're sick of the minutiae about birthday cakes and whatever else, I think they know how serious this is.
Right. I mean, is it really sustainable, Stephen Crabb, that the Prime Minister tomorrow, no doubt at Prime Minister's Questions, says to every single question posed by Keir Starmer and his own side, let's just wait for the Sue Gray report and the Metropolitan Police inquiry?
Yeah. Well, in fairness to the Prime Minister, he hasn't just been using the line of relying on the Sue Gray report.
Well, so if you think,
no. In fairness to the Prime Minister, he has shown contrition. He's given an apology at the dispatch box, and the statements from the Downing Street spokespeople about some of the allegations have directly responded to some of the reports. So in fairness to him, it isn't just about saying, well, let's wait for the outcome of the Sue Gray inquiry.
All right, Chris Mason, I think we have to let you go because I think you're needed elsewhere, probably chasing after other Tory MPs running away. Exactly, running away from you, but thank you for joining us today. In amidst all of this, one minister has resigned. Lord Agnew of Alton, who served as a Cabinet and Treasury Minister, resigned yesterday, attacking the government's handling of fraudulent COVID business loans. Let's take a look.
My Lords, you can see is my deeply held conviction that the current state of affairs is not acceptable. Given that I'm the Minister for Counter Fraud, it feels somewhat dishonest to stay on in that role if I'm incapable of doing it properly, let alone defending our track record. It is for this reason that I've sadly decided to tender my resignation as a Minister across the Treasury and Cabinet Office with immediate effect.
Did you do the right thing? Is that what taking responsibility as a minister when you make a mistake looks like, Stephen?
If he felt that he couldn't carry on doing his role with credibility, then it's the right outcome. I actually thought it was the wrong decision on the specific issue. I mean, the truth is, when we had to get money out of the door of the Treasury extremely quickly at the start of the pandemic, a deliberate choice was taken to loosen some of the normal controls. And it was the same for universal credit. That is why you have this increase in fraud and error.
But the principle that, as a minister, if mistakes are made on your watch, you take responsibility. Is that what ministers should do?
Yes, yes. You know, there is a convention that ministers, when things go badly wrong, in certain circumstances, will take a decision to resign. It's by no means the norm, and it obviously depends on a case-by-case basis, Jo.
Kim?
It's an interesting principle, isn't it? Yeah, let's see how that plays out over the next couple of days or weeks. Yeah, I mean, what worried me about this situation yesterday with Lord Agnew resigning was the money that has been wasted. Between £4 and £5 billion that has just been written off. I've got hairdressers writing to me, I've got travel agents writing to me, I've got people who are struggling to keep their businesses afloat, and we're happy to just say bye-bye to nearly £5 million. This cannot be right.
Kim, it wasn't like that. The truth was that, as I said a moment ago, they had to get their money out of the door extremely quickly.
They were giving money out to businesses that didn't even exist before COVID, the pandemic began.
And that's clearly...
There was no due diligence. There was just no... I mean, the most basic cursory checks of, you know, asking for like a couple of pieces of paperwork to prove you existed in advance, had a business bank account. None of that was actually done.
And I was speaking
and it's our money that was wasted, and civil servants have written it off. I want people to go to jail for that.
It's outrageous. I was speaking to a business in my constituency the other day. They took nothing during lockdown. They took no furlough. They took nothing. A really strong manufacturing business, and now they're really struggling, and they've got nothing available to them.
But as we know, the police don't investigate retrospective crimes.
And then let's go to the other.
So the right response is we want the government to redouble its efforts to investigate those examples of fraud and error. But my point was a very basic one about explaining why, whether it's for universal credit, whether it's for furlough, some of the normal practices of due diligence didn't happen. That was the price to pay for getting the support out there immediately.
Stephen Bush?
I think this is quite difficult for the government, precisely because actually the line to take that it was a crisis, we've prioritised getting money out of the door, is a pretty good one, up until the minister responsible stands up and says, actually, I don't think this is a good line, I'm going to quit. And I think it's a big problem because, yeah, the group of people who are angriest with the government and have been for some time are self-employed people in small businesses, in restaurants and whatnot, which feel they had a huge amount of paperwork. They would not recognise this description that the Treasury prioritised getting money out of the door. I think then it adds to the problem that the government already has over these COVID breaches. But I think in some ways the unwritten story here is, look, why isn't the parliamentary party going, look, we've got a problem with Boris Johnson, but there's a very popular guy in number 11 called Rishi Sunak, let's sort of press the button, Mark Rishi. It's because they're concerned that some of these questions about decisions made in the pandemic aren't just a problem for Boris Johnson, they're a problem for everyone who currently serves in the government, and that's one of the reasons why Conservative MPs are reluctant to get rid of Boris Johnson just yet.
Right, just before we move on though, Stephen, the discussion and debate about the hike in national insurance coming up in April, at the moment that is still going ahead, but there have been reports that Cabinet Ministers, some of them are happy. What would that do if that was delayed or postponed? Would that help bolster Boris Johnson?
Yeah, I definitely would. I mean, not least because it would mean not going into the local elections with this double whammy. Although, of course, what's going to happen in energy prices is going to be the more painful part. But every little helps in terms of the pressure on households. It may be that these improved OBR forecasts mean that the issue goes away for this Parliament. The OBR's forecasting they probably have about 13 billion extra to play with. What does this tax rise? 13 billion. So you can see how potentially the budget is something which eases the pressure on the Prime Minister.
Well, it's the headline, one of them in the Mail. Kill-off tax hike. Former Brexit Chief Lord Frost urges Boris Johnson to scrap that planned national insurance rise. Do you agree? Should it be scrapped?
No.
Postponed?
If they can come up with an alternative way of getting £34 billion into the NHS and social services that doesn't involve increasing the national insurance, we're all ears. We want to see it.
Answers on a postcard.
But there was a very clear plan with a very clear rationale. That's why most MPs voted for it on my side of the House. But if, because of extra headroom in the budget forecasts, or because there's a clever wheeze that they've come up with for raising money elsewhere, then we want to hear that. No Conservative wants to go down this road of increasing.
Most MPs held their noses to vote for that, opposed to tax rises anyway, but national insurance in particular, hitting people on the lowest incomes who aren't even eligible to pay income tax yet. It's an incredibly bad decision to raise. If you're going to do that, put it on the basic rate of income tax that everyone then pays, who at least pays tax.
All right, we're going to talk about COVID. I want to show you another headline in the Mail. The WHO, World Health Organization chief, warns that it is dangerous to assume that Omicron is the endgame variant of COVID and that more strains could form in the future. Let's talk to Dr. Duncan Robertson, a policy and strategy expert at Loughborough University. Duncan, what do you make of what the WHO is warning about? Do you agree with them?
Well, they're looking at it from the worldwide perspective, and I think we have to remember we are in a pandemic, so it is very much a worldwide response. And I think what they're concerned with is we still have a large amount of transmission, for example, in the UK, but globally we have a large number of people who are completely unvaccinated, about 3 billion. And even in the UK, it's just over 3/4 of people who have been vaccinated. So they're also kind of emphasising that Omicron isn't a mild disease. And, the effects that people can have by getting it and sort of the long COVID effects. So they're really emphasising the fact that it's not over. And, we have to cast our minds back a year to remember that the variants can come from any place. This time last year, we were talking about the Kent variant.
Right. Well, then, looking at the situation here, Duncan, in your view, has it been the right thing to abandon the Plan B restrictions in England at this point? What do you make of the timing?
Well, I think it was very abrupt. It's obviously a political decision about when these changes are made. And,
too soon?
We have to... Well, I mean, it depends what you mean, because we have to remember that 17,500 beds in the NHS are being taken up by people with COVID, and they, of course, could be used for getting the backlog of elective cases through. And we have 1,800 deaths a week. And really, that's a kind of political decision about whether that's acceptable. And that's really something that only governments can decide.
The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, said earlier on today, the hope for epidemiologists is that we are seeing a coronavirus which continues to mutate into something much closer to the common cold. We are not there yet. Is he right to say that?
Well, I think it's the hope of everyone that this goes away. I think the problem is that it's not going away. The justification for opening up some of these restrictions is that case rates are falling across the population in the UK, but of course they're starting to increase in younger school children, and we're starting to see that increase moving over to the parents of those younger school children. And of course this puts vulnerable household members at potential risk.
Is this the end game, Julia?
Can I just think about that? 1,800 deaths a week. Those are people who've died within 28 days of a positive COVID test. A huge number of those people, very, very large number of those people, simply have tested positive whilst being treated for something else.
Well, we won't know exactly the statistics, but they're the ones that we've worked with all the way
but
through.
that was dishonest by someone who knows better. Plan B was brought in for a political reason, and it's being got rid of for a political reason. Should never have been brought in. The one thing that this has exposed is actually, with the contrast with what's going on in Europe and between Scotland, Wales and England in the British Isles, is that actually those restrictions don't make any difference. They're about the theatre of COVID, not about actually saving lives. Other than the working from home, which simply delays infection, the masks, the vaccine passports, all of that, that is simply COVID theatre, and it's political and it's not based on the science. So I, for one, am absolutely delighted, but we shouldn't have had Plan B in the first place.
Duncan?
So you have to look at the ONS figures that have come out today. To be precise, 1,382 cases mentioned COVID on the death certificate in the week to 14th of January.
Yes.
So this is, of course, doctors making that professional judgment. And I think, you can, of course, question that, but you have to think about the reality as well.
Do you think the restrictions have made a marked difference, Kim?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I'm not privy to the science and behind the restrictions, but my feeling is, particularly up in Yorkshire where I am, we've still got a high prevalence of cases. And, you know, thank goodness it's not as severe, but it is severe for some people. This narrative about it being a mild disease. I know people who've been seriously ill with this, and these are young, fit, healthy people. So I think how you feel about restrictions is largely guided by your experience of the pandemic. I have clinically vulnerable friends and family members. That makes me more cautious. But equally, I don't want to be restricting people's freedoms. I think a very good point was made there about global vaccinations. The sooner we do that, the better. And then we can all go back to normal, whatever that looks like in the end. But I think, you know, I think about clinically vulnerable people. I think about people who have really struggled during the last 2 years, and that makes me a little bit more cautious. And the workforce thing as well, you know, where I am, we've got a massive issue around teachers being off sick, people in schools being off sick, nurses still struggling. You know, the NHS is still struggling in West Yorkshire. We're not even past the peak, so I am concerned.
And so did the Prime Minister lift them too soon, those Plan B restrictions?
Well, my worry is, again, it was a political decision, and it was a decision that was probably based around statistics.
Political, I suppose, in that sense.
Well, rather than a scientific or evidence-based decision, but also based around statistics for the south of England, rather than necessarily looking at the north of England as well.
But something that the Labour Party supports.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, we don't want to lock people down. I think people...
Well, there's a big difference, but there's a big difference.
Based on SAGE modelling, predicting at least 3,000 deaths a day at the peak in January. What have we had?
We voted for Plan B, and I think that was absolutely the right thing to do at the time.
If you look at where Labour are actually in government, in Wales, they love lockdown. I mean, they
don't love lockdown, Stephen. Nobody loves lockdown.
Their response to Omicron was to criminalise people who wanted to go to the workplace, introducing fines for people wanting to work from their workplace. They banned outdoor park runs on the basis of zero scientific evidence.
These, you know, again, we know that these are really difficult decisions.
They're not difficult decisions if they're based on the science.
But my point is, if you look at where Labour are in power, had Labour been in office in Westminster, we would still be under severe lockdown restrictions.
That is not true at all.
Absolutely.
But there has been a difference, hasn't there, between Keir Starmer and Mark Drakeford in terms of the lines on restrictions. One of the things that Wales isn't doing is compulsory vaccination or mandatory vaccinations for NHS staff in April. Do you think he's right on that?
I listened to the evidence from Sajid Javid and his advisors about the importance of ensuring a healthy, COVID-free workplace in the NHS in England, and I supported the measure in Parliament.
How is that COVID-free?
And if the government are looking again at that, then I'm sure that would be welcomed by a great many colleagues.
All right, I'm just going to go to Stephen Bush. Stephen, do you think it's going to be delayed, that policy of mandatory vaccinations here in England for the NHS?
It's certainly possible, not least because it's very divisive on the Conservative benches. The Prime Minister has discussed is under political difficulty. But because of the pressures on the NHS in general, if you are causing people to leave the workplace, you may get to a point where you decide the clinical decision. You're better off having more people in the NHS who aren't vaccinated than you are having fewer NHS workers. So I think that will be a decision that goes down to the wire.
Is it justified, Duncan, the policy?
Well, I think, you know, vaccination doesn't eliminate transmission, but it does reduce it. And I think, you know, it's once again, these turn into ethical and political questions. But I think you have to remember that 6 out of 10 black adults have had their second dose compared to 9 out of 10 white adults. So it does raise wider questions about equity.
Right. I mean, who has the best policy, do you think, when it comes to mandatory vaccinations or not? Mark Drakeford or Boris Johnson?
I found this a really difficult decision. And I spoke to my colleagues within the NHS up in West Yorkshire. I spoke to senior management. I spoke to nurses. I spoke to cleaners in hospitals. And I really wanted to hear from them their views on this. Their view was that mandatory vaccination was the right policy, even though it's a difficult policy. And I hate the idea of enforcing anything on people. I really don't like it. But I think in this instance, we have to be looking at public health overall and protecting patients, vulnerable patients who are going into hospitals.
Royal College of Nursing, British Medical Association, Royal College of GPs, they all oppose this policy on the grounds that Stephen Bush just touched on, that actually you've got a trade-off like we have in care homes. That, well, OK, you must be double jabbed to work with vulnerable elderly people in a care home, but actually it's better to have somebody who's not double jabbed, who probably has already had COVID, who's actually there than being short-staffed and people being left, you know, sitting, you know, without any care all day. These are difficult trade-offs, and again, they are actually trade-offs that are having to be made by politicians, electable, accountable politicians. They can't be made made by an academic on stage. On balance, I would certainly say I think the policy is, that's one policy Mark Drakeford seems to have got right. I would encourage anyone working in the NHS to have the jab. I think bodily autonomy, though, is so basic and crucial that we can never, ever say that that's something that we will say, oh, well, in this case, we won't insist on it.
Stephen?
Yeah, I have a lot of sympathy for what Julia says. And like I said, if the government do want to look at this, I'm sure, again, at this issue, I'm sure that that would be welcomed by a great many colleagues.
Thank you to Dr Duncan Robertson for joining us to discuss the COVID restrictions. Let's show you some pictures, I think we can, of the military build-up on the Ukrainian border, the Russian threat of war that is hanging over the country and the responses from the EU and the UK as we wait to see what happens. There is also the potential impact on already soaring gas prices here because it shone a light on the controversial gas pipeline from Russia to Germany. Let's have a listen to the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss speaking in Brussels yesterday.
I am very, very concerned about Europe's energy dependence on Russian gas, and I'm very clear that Nord Stream 2 should not go ahead in the event of an incursion into Ukraine.
Should it ever go ahead?
As I've said, I would like to see Europe reduce its dependency on Russian gas.
Liz Truss there. We're joined now by Clive Moffat, an energy market analyst and contributor to Conservative Home. Clive, we just heard the Foreign Secretary there saying she wants to see Europe become less reliant on Russian gas. How reliant is Europe on it?
Europe, Germany, particularly that part of Central Europe, is quite heavily dependent on imports from Gazprom. We, at the moment, are not, but Russia does contribute probably about 5% of our LNG requirements, which come by tanker.
What would the impact of this reliance, and this is Europe's reliance, do to domestic energy prices here, closer to home, even if we are less reliant currently?
Yes, the effect of any conflict would have a ricochet effect on wholesale market prices. So while, in fact, to some extent, prices have come down a little, we can expect if there is conflict, God forbid, that prices will in fact escalate further on the world gas market.
Can you give us a sense of the figures, the percentages in terms of our reliance on gas from Russia?
We are significantly less than, in terms of direct pipeline supplies, we are significantly, it's probably less than 5%. And basically what happens is the gas comes in and is re-exported to us via pipelines from Europe. But there's no immediate short-term fix for Europe being dependent on natural gas, whether it be from Russia or from Qatar in terms of LNG. There is increasingly, because of the decision by Western Europe to effectively decarbonize the energy sector, you've had significant investment in wind farms. And the more you invest in wind, the more you require flexible gas generation to be there when the wind isn't blowing.
Right. I mean, on that point, Stephen Bush, are we making ourselves more vulnerable, in a way, to gas, and in that case, gas supplies from Russia?
No, I mean, the missing energy source in that otherwise very lucid explanation is nuclear power, right? This is actually a result of the decision taken, by Angela Merkel to cancel Germany's nuclear power, the decision taken by Tony Blair and Gordon Brown not to continue the Thatcher legacy of building new nuclear power plants here in the United Kingdom. And what we are once again being shown is if you want a decarbonised energy market, which we badly need, then you do have to be open to nuclear power as part of the solution. Because yes, you can have renewables for some of it, but when you need that sort of that backstop of reliable energy generation, but no, you can do net zero without being reliant on Russian or Qatari gas. You just have to be willing to be courageous and by supporting nuclear power, something which actually this government has been much better at than either the Labour government or the John Major government that came before that one.
Clive, do you agree with that?
No, I take a view that one of the weaknesses successive governments. 10 years ago, we were arguing with government about the need to underpin natural gas as an essential transition requirement towards net zero in the longer term, basically because of our continued reliance on heat and power for gas. And there is going to be a continued reliance on natural gas, not necessarily whether it comes from Siberia, but whether it comes from anywhere else in the world. And the other related problem is that we knew over 10 years ago that we would require more flexible gas plant in the system. And that's why we set up the capacity market mechanism, as did the rest of Europe.
Yes.
But the problem is that capacity hasn't come forward. So we're faced with a risk that if we don't have enough gas in backup system as we go through towards the evolution towards net zero, that we are going to have shortage of power.
Right. Stephen?
I think the situation is actually better than the one that he describes.
Right.
You know, we have a diversity of gas supply, and diversity of energy supply is what gives you energy security. So when it comes to gas supply, there's Russian LNG cargoes, actually a very small part of our gas supply.
But it's this question of reliability, isn't it, when it comes to renewables as the transition?
40% of our gas supply still comes from the North Sea, so we're very blessed to have that domestic resource, and we should absolutely try and maximise that. But a couple of references have been made to Qatari gas. Actually, Qatar has proved an extremely reliable energy partner for the UK over the last 15 years. So we shouldn't raise false concerns about security of supply there. We've actually the problem with gas is it's expensive, and that's a global economic issue.
Right, false concerns.
Would be a lot less expensive if we fracked our own shale gas. If we look at gas prices in America, they've become incredibly self-sufficient. Look, energy, whatever kind of energy it is from whatever form, it needs to be affordable, it needs to be reliable, and it needs to be secure. Ours is none of those at the current time. We have some of the highest energy prices. They're going up. Millions of families in this country are going to be unable to afford to heat and light their homes in a few months' time. And that is largely down to failures of this Tory government, previous Tory governments, previous Labour governments, an abject failure.
Julia.
The signing up to net zero is an insanity, which I very much hope the Tory government will be talked out of by voters very, very soon.
We have an energy price crisis. We do not have an energy security crisis.
Right, Kim?
I'm seriously concerned about the price of gas. I'm seriously concerned about the price of fuel. We absolutely need to be looking at other sources of energy. We need to be looking at wind power. We need to be looking at tidal power. We need to be looking at other options. But I'm far more concerned about what's going on in Ukraine from a world security perspective. We need to make sure that we are united with our international allies, and we are pulling together in these coming days, and if not hours, to make sure that Putin is not allowed to invade Ukraine. That's the bigger issue here.
Right, well, Stephen, can Liz Truss, though, the Foreign Secretary, while this transition is going on, you heard what Julia said about rising energy prices, can she be so definitive about saying no to that pipeline, that second pipeline?
Well, the difficulty is it's not wholly in her control, but she is, of course...
That's true.
But she is, I think, absolutely right on the policy merits, right? It shapes the way that Western Europe and Germany responds to Russian foreign policy decisions that we are dependent on Russian gas. And you cannot meet our net zero target if you are continuing to use carbon-intensive sources of energy. Of course, the problem is, and actually this is not really a Brexit issue, this would be true if we were still in the European Union. The problem is, of course, while Liz Truss is exactly right on the merits of the policy, she doesn't have all that many levers she can pull, because really the useful lever to be able to pull would be a situation in which we had more nuclear power plants than we could sell our excess energy to Europe, rather than this situation we currently have, where we have, people just, with these fantasies about the idea that we're going to be able to unlock lower gas prices through fracking or whatever.
All right, well, thank you to all of my guests, and thank you to Clive for joining us for that discussion. Just very quickly before you go, constituents writing to you about this, about energy prices and net zero being a mad idea?
Not so many, a few.
They will. Don't worry, they will.
That's all we have time for from all of us here. I'll be back, of course, tomorrow with Prime Minister's Questions at 11:15. But until then, bye-bye.